Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the House of Orange Sports Channel. I'm Kerry Williams, and today I'm going to be bringing you the corner infielder preview for this upcoming baseball season. If you haven't seen me before, I've been doing some of the post-game shows as well as the Monday night shows with Frank, doing some of the live shows with him. But today I'm going to be bringing you the corner infielder preview since he's already hit the catching position and the pitching position preview. So that's two positions, first base and third base, that you lost two huge guys in. First off, at first base, you lost Blake Burke, 2-year starter in the program, been here for 3 years, drafted 34th overall by the Milwaukee Brewers. Hopefully, we will see him in the MLB in the coming years. That's a guy that gave production whenever he was in the batter's box and whenever he was fielding at first base as well. Batted 379 last season, had 20 home runs and 61 RBIs. He also excelled whenever he played in the first base position and fielding the baseball. He's a guy that struggled a little bit in 2023, but he made up for it with how good of a fielder he was, and he did even better at the fielding position this last season. He's a starter that you don't win a national championship if you don't have him. You may not even reach Omaha if he wasn't on the team last season. So he's a guy that's been a tremendous help to this program. It's a big loss, but unfortunately, it's college baseball. You're going to have turnover. You just got to figure out a way to fill the production. You thought you did have some sort of an answer in Alex Perry, but unfortunately, the news was broke in the past few days that he has moved on from the program, taking this season this season and this semester away from the Tennessee baseball program since he is going through some personal things. So hope all is well there. I know he was the projected starting first baseman for this season. He excelled in fall ball. The coaching staff loved the production that he gave. He's a shortstop transfer from a JUCO, Pearl River Community College, where he actually won a national championship there, and he had some great numbers there as well. He was the guy that we kind of expected to play first base since he wasn't necessarily going to see the field at the shortstop position. Possibly could have saw him at the third base position. I think you may still end up possibly seeing him at third base in the next few years, but of course he's not going to be a part of the team this season. It may end up like the Zane Denton situation where he doesn't play again for Tennessee baseball and ends up at a different program. But time will tell with that. But essentially, you've lost Blake Burke. You've lost essentially your starter for this upcoming season and Alex Perry. But you don't win a national championship last season and not have options to play first base. So you do have a lot of options, in my opinion. I've listed 6. I'm sure there are a lot more than 6. There's probably 10 guys that could play first base, and you probably not tell any difference with. I've listed Dalton Bargo, Stone Lawless, Levi Clark, Blake Grimmer, Jackson Jones, and Hunter High. First off, Dalton Bargo, guy from Omaha, Nebraska, transferred in from Missouri, transferred in as a catcher, considering that's what he played at Missouri. Wasn't going to see the field at the catching position, so he is also just a utility man, so he has ended up at different places. He can play first base, he can play third base, he can play left and right field as well. But I do think you end up seeing him being the starting first baseman this season. He may not actually end up playing in the field at all. He may just be a DH because the bat is what the bat is. Batted 280 last season. He only had 8 home runs, but those were all big. Those were some big 8 home runs, and a lot of them came in SEC play. So good for him. I know he had the 2 home run game in a super regional to send Tennessee to the College World Series. So there's a lot of production that can be made whenever it comes to him at first base and in the batter's box. A lot of upside for him. In my opinion, he is your starter, considering Alex Perry is no longer with the program. So if I had to make a prediction on who's your starting first baseman come week 1, it would be Dalton Bargo. You also have, of course, a lot of other options. You got Stone Lawless. He's a catcher, redshirt freshman. Dude's a refrigerator. He is the biggest guy on the team by far. I've seen this man in person in warm-ups last season. He doesn't just play the catching position. He, of course, also plays first base. You may end up seeing him play first base. We will see. He was ranked the 244th overall player from Perfect Game. So he was in the top 300 whenever it comes to rankings. So there is upside with him. I know he has a lot of pop in the bat, just considering how huge the man is. I'm not sure whenever it comes to the fielding aspect of things, but what I did see in person was really exciting and really good. So you do have a potential of him playing at first base, just considering how stacked the catcher position is. And that leads me to another guy that's another catcher that can play first base, and that's Levi Clark. That's the number 36 overall ranked guy from Perfect Game in this past recruiting class. He's a guy that was not drafted by the MLB draft. I'm not sure how he wasn't drafted, just considering how highly ranked he was. He actually went to Arizona to the MLB draft combine. There's only 319 players that get invited to that, and he was one of them. So and he actually, it's not like he flopped at the draft combine either. He was, I think, one of the days he was like one of the top performers. I saw an article on that written by MLB. So it's not like he's just not as good as what they expected him to be. He's a catcher that may not see the field at the catching position right now. So he can play first base and he can also play third base. But I think there is potential you do see him at first base just because there's a lot of upside. He's a great fielder and he has a great bat as well. So he's a guy I'm high on. You may not necessarily see him in too big of a role this season, although I think you will at some point. But and definitely in the future, he is a name to look out for. Also, at the first base position, you have a guy that's already on the roster that potentially can get some reps or may even end up being the starter. We will see, and that's Blake Grimmer, 6'3", 200-pound redshirt freshman from Michigan. He was ranked 148th overall from Perfect Game whenever he came in. He is an infielder. He's not necessarily a first baseman to say, considering he's not this huge guy. So he can play other places throughout the infield. You may see him at shortstop. You could even see him at third base, although I just don't think you necessarily see him on the field too much if it's not at first base. He's a guy, his profile picture on UT Sports is him in a first baseman's glove. So you may end up seeing him at some point in first baseman, just considering how the season goes. You also have another guy in Jackson Jones, who was a high school kid that was recruited as a first baseman from Kansas. 500th overall from Perfect Game. I don't think he's necessarily a guy you see hit the field at all this season. Also, another guy, Hunter High, who was on the roster last year, played good in the chances he did get last season. I think he may have been going through a little bit of some injury issues last year because the staff does have a lot of upside from him. Not the highest ranked guy, but it's just a guy the staff loves. So you may end up seeing him at first base. I know he has been mentioned to play first base through some of the journalists that cover the team in fall baseball. So we'll see how that eventually turns out. I'm not sure what direction that goes in. He is a second baseman. He's not necessarily a big guy, but if he's listed to be able to play first base and they've played him at first base, we don't know in what direction that's going to go in. Overall, that wraps up first base. We're going to move on to third base now. You only lost one guy there just because that wasn't a position that you had a lot of guys playing, just because you had Billy Amick over there at third base. He played almost every game except whenever he got injured, kind of early in the season. Just nailed that transfer portal addition out of Clemson. I know he batted over 400 at Clemson. He was upset with the Clemson coaching staff at what his role was. So he transferred over to Tennessee and became a star. Batted 306 last year, slugged 639, had 23 home runs and 65 overalls, and was ultimately drafted 60th overall by the Minnesota Twins. That's a guy that necessarily didn't give everything you expected to when it comes to the fielding aspect of things. He did get the job done, though, even though he did have a lot of errors. But that was just something that you kind of did expect with him. That's kind of what was heard before he came here. Of the fielding isn't necessarily what you expect it to be, but he has to see the field just because of how good of a bat he has. And he proved that last year, being one of the, I'd say, top 3 contributors the entire season whenever it came from in the batter's box. So that's another guy just like Blake Burke that's really hard to replace. But thankfully, Tennessee, they went out and they landed the number 1 guy in the transfer portal, and that's Andrew Fisher from Ole Miss. Fisher's a junior, started his journey at Duke, played really well there, ended up at Ole Miss last season. He was a starting third baseman, batted 285 there last season. He had 20 home runs and 57 RBIs, slugged 4 points higher than Billy Amick did last season, coming in at 643. He was all SEC second team. He led Ole Miss in hits, RBIs, triples, home runs, and total bases. He's also in 3 other statistics, was second on Ole Miss team. One of those I know for sure was walks. He was also the 4th Rebel in their entire history to hit 20-plus home runs in a season. So that says everything you need to say in itself. And he also had 4 multi-home run games. One of them was a 3 home run game against South Carolina. And he also had one against Tennessee whenever he hit 2 home runs in Knoxville. That's a guy that his bat is elite. That's you brought him out of the transfer portal because of his bat. He does play third base, but he ended up kind of having some of the same issues that Billy Amick had of the bat's there, the fielding's not really entirely there. So they actually shifted him to right field last season where he did play a lot better in that right field position. So you may end up seeing him playing an outfield spot at some point. I think you roll with him being your starting third baseman to start and just play out things kind of like how you played out the Billy Amick situation. But if you have to, he can end up playing in the outfield or another position if the fielding isn't there and he's hurting you by playing third base. Next guy I got listed is Dean Curley. I'm not going to hit too much on him just because I'm going to be talking about him in my middle infielder in preview, but he's a guy that played third base last year whenever Amick did go down with injury. He played the position very well. I know he was brought in as a shortstop and a third baseman, so he's a guy that can play third base if you need him to. And it may end up there is a situation that I'll hit on in the middle infielder preview that could end up being the best case scenario for Tennessee when it comes to getting your best defenders on the field. And that scenario does have Dean Curley at third base. But I'm not going to hit too much on him. You know what he is. You know what production he gave you last year of a tremendous freshman season out of nowhere. So he is an option at third base, but of course, I'm not going to hit on him too much. Next, you got a guy named Chris Newstrom. He's a high school recruit from Arizona, 118th overall, listed as a shortstop from Perfect Game, but I feel like he can play the third baseman position. And you may not necessarily see him, but there's a possibility his name gets mentioned. He may play a midweek game or two. So he's a guy you do have to look out for when it comes to third base. I don't necessarily see him being too much of a role player when it comes to third base. There's a few guys that's listed. Also, you have the Manny Marine that's kind of in the same situation of it's going to be hard for him to see the field, even though he's actually a higher ranked freshman from Florida. He's a shortstop commit, or not commit, shortstop signee. He was the 88th overall player from Perfect Game. Somehow didn't get drafted, so he ends up on Rocky Top. We'll take him. He won't see the shortstop position for another year or two, maybe even 3 years if he can stick it out. We'll see how his journey turns out. I feel like he's a kid that if you're that highly of a ranked shortstop, you can play third base as well. So we will see what direction that goes in. I think he may end up seeing the field. I know he was listed to be a guy to be on the lookout for. Of he could see the field in some sort of way this upcoming season. I have a huge upside on him. I would actually, if I had to bet, I think you do see him play in the field at least some point in the season. I would guarantee him to see the field in a midweek spot, maybe even early season weekend series. But we'll see how that pans out. You also have two other freshman guys that I just don't think you see the field. They'll be guys that's listed a part of the team, but you probably will never hear anything about them this season. That's Robinson Martin and Dane Morrow. Those are just two guys that you brought in that can play the infield, and I feel like can play the third base position, but I don't think you necessarily see them this season. You also have your other two first basemen that can also play third base. You have Dalton Bargo and you have Levi Clark. Those are two guys that can play the position. Bargo did actually play the position last year at times whenever Amick was out, whenever Amick got hurt, whenever Amick was going through some struggles at third base, and they kind of put him in a DH spot. You saw Bargo play third base a little bit, and he did, in my opinion, really well there. So he may actually end up being the starting third baseman if Fisher ends up getting moved to the outfield. You also have Levi Clark. He's listed to play catcher, first base, and third base, and I think he can play the position. I think he's too good of a bat to keep off the field this season, and he's just too good of a player. I mean, there's somehow in some sort of way he didn't get drafted, and he ends up on Rocky Top, and that's a good enough sign for me to give the kid a shot because he didn't get drafted just because he wasn't good enough. He's shown the promise that he's good enough, so he's a kid that I think you'll see at least in some sort of way. I don't know what fashion that's going to be, but I think he does have an impact on this Tennessee baseball team this season. Overall, that's all the options at third base. So you got Andrew Fisher, Dean Curley, Chris Newstrom, Manuel Marine goes by Manny, Robinson Martin, Dane Morrow, and Dalton Bargo and Levi Clark. Those are the options that I have at third base. Of course, plenty of other options. I mean, this is college baseball. You have guys that come in as shortstops and they end up being outfielders. It's just how this goes. There's a lot of guys on the team that can play a lot of different positions. These are just the guys, in my opinion, that could play the positions. I feel like I'm probably forgetting somebody that I mentioned today. And if I have, and you know who that is, just drop it in the comments so other people will be able to see that. Um, Overall, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Be sure to check out the other videos. I know that Frank put out the pitching and the catching previews, and I'm going to be putting out the middle infielder preview and the outfielder preview as well in the coming days. So hopefully you'll tune into those and enjoy those as well. Be sure to hit that like, share, subscribe button, turn on notifications. And I know that Frank does have some options down in the bio to become a member of the channel. We do appreciate that because all that you give to us goes back into the channel to provide good content for you guys. Overall, thank you guys for tuning in today. And as always, it's a great day to wear the orange.